Good morning and welcome. Thank you to everyone who is able to join us on today's webinar or in the archived version, which will be posted to our new Perkins V resource page later this week. My name is Ben Williams, and I'm very pleased to join you as the new CEO of the National Alliance for Partnerships in Equity. Starting this fall, NAPE will be providing a series of webinars/web-based technical assistance, in-person activities, and regularly updated resource materials on the new Perkins V webpage, which can be accessed from the NAPE webpage or directly from www.napeequity.org/Perkins V or Perkins 5. Our goal is to provide resources in a timely manner for states and local education agencies to plan for and implement the requirements under the recently passed Strengthening Career and Technical Education for the 21st Century Act, or affectionately known as Perkins 5. And you will find these new resources if you visit our website. There's a new banner that you can click on, or a button from the homepage, or there's a drop down also from public policy. And we will be sharing with you all any new materials that are posted throughout the next several months, and as time passes, as we are moving further and into the Perkins transition planning and later 4-year planning process. So thank you again for joining us, and without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our recently retired but still very busy CEO Emerita, Mimi Lufkin, who will lead today's webinar, which will provide an overview of the equity provisions in Perkins 5. Mimi?
Thank you, Ben. Hi, everyone. How are you all? I think Ben gave us a good introduction, and so I'm going to go ahead and dig right in here and start getting into the topics. We have a lot to cover in today's webinar, and so please, if you have any questions or anything you'd like to address with me, please put those in the chat box, and we'll monitor the chat function as best as we can to ensure that your questions get answered, as well as at the end, we'll hopefully have an opportunity for you all to ask additional questions and also possibly engage in some discussion. So today's topics are quite a few. I think Ben has already adequately covered the fact that we have a new resource page. So again, there's the link in case you're interested in going there. I did also want to mention that on today's webinar, if you look under the materials section of your control panel, you'll see that there is a handout for today, and that handout will basically cover the same material that I'm going to be talking about, so it'll be a great resource for you when we're done. This document will also be available on our resource page, so feel free to go to the website and you can get it there as well. So today we're going to talk about definitions within state allocation, specifically about the reserve and the set-asides that exist in the within state allocation. Accountability, national activities, state plan language, improvement plans, state leadership activities, local application, local uses of funds, and lastly, a new GAO study that's included in the Act. So to start with, let's do a quick poll and let's see who's here today. So I'm going to pop a poll up here, and if you could indicate which kind of an organization you represent, and if none of these options work for you, please feel free to let us know where you're from in the chat box. This will give me a sense of who's on today's webinar and what emphasis I might want to place on some of the content that I talk about. So this is very interesting because this is, this is an encore webinar today. We did one on Monday where we had about half and half, local education agency and state education agencies represented. But it looks like today we have a larger representation of the local education agencies. Let me share the results of the poll with you so you can see who's here as well. So you'll see 54% LEAs, 35% SEAs, and the remaining are a variety of other organizations. So glad to see that we've got folks from local community-based organizations, national organizations, and even some federal agency representatives here today too. Fantastic. All right. So let's set the stage. The first thing I want to make sure that I'm clear about is when we talk about equity in Perkins 5, what is it that we mean? What are the provisions that I'm going to review with you today? And what are the things that, as you're implementing Perkins 5, to pay attention to that may have implications or equity implications as you're doing your implementation? The first is I look for these particular words. So any reference to special populations in the legislation, certainly any reference to non-traditional fields, careers, programs, that language. There's significant language in the law also about high skill, high wage, in demand, which if you look at what those occupations are, they tend to be occupations that are non-traditional, particularly for women. And so, again, those are flags around equity questions. There's a lot of language in this particular act around gap analysis and a needs assessment, so we'll be focusing on that. And the gap analysis and needs assessment has a section in it that's focused specifically on looking at performance of each of the special populations, disaggregated by gender and by race and special population status. So that's something to pay attention to. Certainly the performance measures and the accountability system, especially because of the continuation of the non-traditional measure in this act, and disaggregation of data and language related to access to career and technical education. So let's start out by taking a look at what we know about some changes that have been made in terms of definitions. And these are the ones I'm going to highlight. Certainly there are others, so I'd recommend that you take a look more closely at the act yourself. But I also want to mention that there are some really great resources that Advanced CTE and ACTE have prepared about the entire bill. The materials that we have will be focused primarily on those provisions that relate to equity. And those other resources are there are links available to those also on our website. So if you go there, you should be able to get those resources. All right, let's start first with a CTE concentrator. So the term CTE, this is a brand new definition in Perkins 5. There was not a definition for CTE concentrator in Perkins 4. The definition really focuses on looking at secondary school students, students that are served by an eligible recipient who has completed at least 2 courses in a single career and technical education program or program of study. And at the post-secondary level, a CTE concentrator is a student who has earned at least 12 credits within a CTE program or program of study, or completed such a program if the program encompasses fewer than 12 credits or an equivalent in total. The CTE concentrator definition is important because it is now the standard for all measures in the accountability system, including the non-traditional measure. We'll get to that in a minute. Non-traditional fields, there's a slight change in the definition of non-traditional fields. The original definition used to say including fields of work such as careers in computer science, technology, and other current and emerging occupations. And that including word has now been changed to such as. The importance of that means that those occupations that are listed as examples are only examples and are not included in the definition of non-traditional. So for example, if careers in computer science, technology, or any other current and emerging occupation exceeds the 25% threshold for gender participation, then that particular occupation will no longer be considered non-traditional. There's also a definition for supportive services that's included in the language as well. And this definition are services related to curriculum modification, equipment modification, classroom modification, supportive personnel, including paraprofessionals and specialized instructional support personnel, and instructional aids and devices. Those supportive services are important because many of these are services that are provided to special population students. There's also a change to the English language learner. Let me back up. Out of workforce individuals. The term out of workforce individuals means an individual who's a displaced homemaker, and this is a replacement. This definition is a replacement for displaced homemaker in the special population definition. So it includes individuals who are displaced homemakers, but it also includes an individual who's primarily worked without remuneration to care for a home or family, and for that reason has diminished marketable skills, or as a parent whose youngest dependent child would become ineligible to receive assistance under Part A of Title IV of the Social Security Act, not later than 2 years after the date on which the parent applies for assistance under such title, and is unemployed. So this is important, the and part. And is unemployed or underemployed and is experiencing difficulty in obtaining or upgrading employment. So the definition for out-of-workforce individuals is a broader definition than displaced homemaker, and that's the terminology that's now used rather than displaced homemaker in the special populations definition, which we'll get to in a minute. As far as English language learners, in Perkins IV, English language learners were considered, were titled limited English proficient, LEP students. So it's a change in language usage. The definition is, although a little more expanded and slightly different, so one to pay attention to. So English learners are a secondary school student who is an English learner as defined in the Elementary Secondary Education Act, or an adult or an out-of-school youth who has limited ability in speaking, reading, writing, or understanding the English language, and whose native language is a language other than English, or who lives in a family environment in which a language other than English is the dominant language. I mentioned earlier there's some changes to the special populations definition. In addition to the use of out-of-workforce individuals to replace displaced homemakers on the list, there are some new populations added to the definition. The addition of homeless individuals, youth who are in or have aged out of the foster care system, and youth with an active military parent have all been added to the special populations definition. So that includes 3 new populations. And however, it maintains the other members, such as students with disabilities, single parents, students preparing for non-traditional fields, and English learners. So there's a slight modification to the individuals from economically disadvantaged families, so that now that also includes low-income youth and adults. That's an addition. And lastly, there's a new definition for universal design for learning. This is a language that's used in a couple of places in the Act. The term universal design for learning means a scientifically valid framework for guiding educational practice that provides flexibility in ways information is presented, reduces barriers in instruction, provides appropriate accommodations, supports and challenges, and maintains high achievement expectations for all students, including students with disabilities and students who are limited English proficient. Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, is frequently used in special education programs, and it's a terminology we hear frequently in that context, but certainly is a strategy to be used with all students in every classroom to ensure equitable outcomes. So those are all the shifts in the definitions in the new law. So I want to ask another question of the group. Let's see what our response might be here. Have you been using concentrators as a population definition for 6S1 and 5P1 under Perkins IV for non-traditional program participation? Curious to know whether participation has been defined as concentrators in your state, or participation has been defined as enrollees. In other words, an individual just has to enroll to be counted in your participation measure for non-traditional. So if we look at the response, we've got we're looking at about a 50-50, maybe a little more. Somebody wants a I don't know option. If you don't know, just go ahead and don't answer the poll, not a problem. Only if you know do you need to answer the poll, so that would help us. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share the poll with you. You see it's almost a 50-50 split, which is interesting because I think there was quite some confusion about this under Perkins IV, and And in the Perkins IV data systems, the states had control over defining their own measurement approaches. So for those of you who've been using concentrators in the past to define participation in non-traditional programs, that this new measure will be the same measure as your 6S1 or 5P1 measure. For those of you, so the shift in the non-trad measure will, the concentration definition will change for you if you've been using enrollees as your definer for 6S1 or 5P1. And so we'll talk more about this when we get to the accountability discussion. So let's talk now about the within state allocation. So in Perkins IV, you may recall that there was a reserve fund that existed in Perkins IV. And this reserve fund was approximately 10% of the allocation that was provided to states from the feds that could be set aside and used for particular purposes. In Perkins V, this particular reserve fund has been increased to 15%. And the criteria for its use is it must be used in rural areas, areas with high percentages of CTE concentrators or participants, areas with high numbers of CTE concentrators or CTE participants, and most importantly in terms of equity is areas with disparities or gaps in performance as described in section 113. We'll talk more about that when we get to the accountability section. But this is really about areas where we see gaps in performance on the accountability measures based on gender, race, or special population status. It does add two purposes to the particular, to the fund. And one of them has to do with equity. It reads, to foster innovation through the identification and promotion of promising and proven CTE programs, practices, and strategies, which may include programs, practices, and strategies that prepare individuals for non-traditional fields. So certainly one of the things that this reserve fund could be used for is to incentivize or fund activities and programs focusing on non-traditional careers across the state in a separate allocation provided or grant program potentially provided in addition to the regular allocation provided to each LEA. In addition, there are some set-asides within the state allocation. The first being increasing funds for serving individuals in state institutions. That is a set-aside that existed in Perkins IV. In Perkins IV, it was 1%, and now in Perkins V, it is 2% of the funds provided in the within state allocation. And it adds juvenile justice facilities and adds educational to modify the description of institutions that serve students with disabilities so that they're focused on educational institutions. There's also a continuation of the state leadership set aside for non-traditional services. And actually the language in Perkins IV was services, and it's now been changed to assisting eligible recipients in providing services. So the purpose of these funds is to assist LEAs in providing services. And the amount remains the same, which is a $60,000 to $150,000 target with a minimum of $60,000. And actually, the reality is under the definition of special populations because of the requirements in the use of state leadership's set-aside funds. There's no cap on the use of these resources because of the other provisions that exist. Lastly, it adds a new set-aside for recruiting special populations to enroll in CTE. And this is also a percentage of the state leadership set aside and the state leadership funds, excuse me. And the state leadership, and this is a new one that is not less than 0.1% of the state leadership funds or $50,000, whichever is less. There's lots of less language in this. When we took a look at this and we used the 2018 state allocation, 0.1% of state leadership funds would be about $498 in North Dakota and a little over $14,000 in California, California being the largest recipient of Perkins funds. So they're never going to reach the $50,000 threshold. So basically what this does is set a baseline for the use of these funds, a minimum that must be used for recruiting special populations, but does not place a cap on the use of these funds. States could certainly use more of their state leadership funds for this particular purpose. All right, let's do another poll. I'm curious to know whether any of you have, in your states, have used the reserve fund under Perkins 4. And again, if you don't know the answer to this question, you can recuse yourself from the poll. And if you have used this or know that your state has used the reserve fund under Perkins 4, maybe you could indicate in the chat box what the purpose of that use was. It would be interesting for us to take a look at that information. Wow, we have quite a large group of folks in this particular response that has indicated the reserve fund was used in their state, 82%. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share it with you so you can see this. We're now at 79%, and 21% indicated no to this response. And we've got a few folks who are indicating how the reserve fund was used. It looks like in Tennessee that there was use of the funds for non-traditional, supporting non-traditional programming. It looks like some support to rural campuses. You can all read those in the chat box. I think those would be interesting for you to see. This, however, does create a wonderful opportunity, the reserve fund does, to do some targeted funding around particular issues or emphasizing aspects of Perkins 5 that may be of critical importance to you that fit under the two purposes. And of course, one of them specifically has to do with non-traditional career preparation. I'm going to skip this poll for right now and move on to accountability. So let's talk about accountability. The changes that we see in accountability and some of the shifts in how the accountability system is set and how it's reported, et cetera. So the non-traditional measure, there's been a change in the definition of the non-traditional measure. In Perkins 4, as you know, the non-traditional measure included two parts, participation in non-traditional programs and completion in non-traditional programs. And in Perkins 5, the measure is a single measure now, basically looking at students who are concentrating in non-traditional programs. It reads the percentage of CTE concentrators in career and technical education programs and programs of study that lead to non-traditional fields. So remember, the concentrator definition I mentioned earlier will apply in this particular case. Secondly, in the past in Perkins 4, the levels of performance were called state negotiated levels of performance because of the negotiation requirements with the secretary. This negotiation process has been removed in Perkins 5 and replaced basically with language now that focuses on state determined levels of performance. So states will set their own levels of performance, their targets, as part of their state plan. And the secretary's authority to manage that process in any way or to drive raising expectations, for example, can only be modified by the secretary's authority to approve or disapprove a state plan. We'll talk more about that in a minute. It does, however, continue to require locals to negotiate performance measures with the state, and there are two options in this case. One is that the local can accept the state's determined levels of performance, or in states that are interested in doing this can actually negotiate levels of performance with LEAs, which is a fairly rigorous process, but the reality is it's a much more accurate one and certainly creates an opportunity for LEAs to improve performance. There are 6 requirements for the state determined levels of performance Two of them deal with issues related to equity. One of them is to require the state to continually make meaningful progress, meaningful not being defined, which will have to be part of our conversations as we are all working to implement Perkins V and what that means. But meaningful progress toward improving the performance of all CTE students, including the subgroups of students described in Section 111 of ESSA. These are basically some of the special population groups, but this also includes gender and race. And special populations, so all the special population groups that are, including the new ones that are in the definition. The second particular requirement of the 6 that I wanted to mention was the fact that the state-determined levels of performance must be higher than the average actual performance of the 2 most recently completed program years. This makes it really critical for states and local educational agencies, if they're in a situation where they're negotiating their performance, to be sure that the baseline data they collect, especially around any new definitions in the measures, is as accurate as possible to ensure that you set appropriate targets that show improvement. There continues to be disaggregation requirements. Data disaggregation required for race, gender, economically disadvantaged youth who are in or have aged out of the foster care system, students with disability, English learners, migrant students, homeless students, students with a parent in the active military, single parents, out-of-work individuals, and students pursuing non-traditional careers. These are all of the populations that are named in Section 111 of ESSA and also the special populations definition. The state reporting, the state and local reports include the actual levels of performance of all CTE concentrators for each of the disaggregated subgroups and CTE program or career clusters, if not practical. So it includes actual levels of performance for each of the disaggregated subgroups and by CTE program or career cluster. These data must be released publicly and also submitted in a report to the secretary from the state or at the local level from the local to the state. And lastly, this report must include a section that identifies and quantifies any disparities or gaps in performance on the state-determined levels of performance between any subgroup, all the ones I mentioned earlier, and the performance of all CTE concentrators. This is the gap analysis that I was mentioning earlier, and it will come up many times throughout the legislation. Okay. Let's do a quick poll. I'm going to share this with you. This one is have you conducted a gap analysis using Perkins accountability measures and the demographic data elements collected under Perkins 4, and have you used it to target resources at the state or local level? Answer yes or no.
Mimi, we're still seeing the old poll.
Oh, oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. Thank you for catching me on that. Have you been seeing that all along?
No.
Okay. Gap analysis.
Here you go.
Got it now?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. All right. While you're answering that poll, I'm going to jump up for a second and quickly close the door to my office. We've got some noise going on in the hallway that I didn't get my door shut earlier. All right. Looks like gap analysis, 40% yes, it's jumping around quite a bit, 60% no. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share it with you. So if you take a look at that, you'll see that about 58% of you have not done this before. Don't know if you're at the state level or the local level, but this is a requirement now that will be included in your local, it'll be all over the place. So your local application, it's included in your local report. So learning how to do this will become very important. And for those of you who've worked with us at NAPE before, you know that the program improvement process for equity that we do with local educational agencies and state education agencies includes this process of a gap analysis. So part of the technical assistance resources and tools that we'll be creating to help you with implementing Perkins V will include this process and hopefully be of use to you. All right, so next, let's take a look at national activities. I'm just going to mention a couple of things here that are important. The first is that there is a National Independent Advisory Panel that will be set to determine how national activities will be implemented. And it does indicate that there's an opportunity for individuals who have particular skill sets or understanding of implementing programs related to special populations should be included, and addressing inequities to access should be included on the advisory panel. So if any of you are interested in serving in that capacity, you might keep that in mind, let the secretary know. There's a new innovation and modernization grant. This is approximately not more than 20% of the appropriation for national programs. It'll fund consortia of at least 2 institutions with a 50% matching requirement. The funds must benefit students, including special populations. And there are 12 uses of funds, and I mentioned a few of these that relate to work that deals with special populations, but professional development to improve instruction and provide appropriate accommodations to special populations, improve CTE concentrator employment outcomes in non-traditional fields, and providing integrated student support for special populations. There will be included in this modernization grant, the evaluation will include disaggregated data results by race, gender, migrant status, special populations, and program. And also there'll be a priority to applicants from entities that will predominantly serve students from low-income families. The national activity section includes a significant role for the secretary of the Institute of Education Sciences and increases their oversight. And although the National Research Center is not specifically named in this particular section anymore, there certainly is no prohibition in the National Activities section for a National Research Center to be funded. And there is priorities for conducting research that will be significant and important, and especially in relationship to looking at how activities have been supporting special population students. All right, let's move on then to the state plan section. And please, again, Kathleen, if there are any questions that pop up that you think I need to address during any of these sections, to remind me to take a look at that. I also want to remind everyone that, again, that there is a handout related to today's webinar. You can find that information in the materials section on your control panel. If you take a look at that, it's a downloadable document. The document is also available on our Perkins website, resource website. You can access that at www.napeequity.org. Just click on the banner that shows Perkins V resources, and it'll take you there. And this is basically will cover everything that I'm talking about today. All right, so jumping on to the state plan. The state plan is basically reduced from a 6-year plan to a 4-year plan. And this reduction, as far as we're concerned, appears to look like it's trying to align itself with WIOA. And there are also opportunities in the plan, or I guess suggestions in the legislation, in the act, that looking at combined plans with WIOA or a single state plan is also an option. The state plan has to be developed in consultation with a variety of groups. There's some new groups mentioned in this particular law. Representatives of minority serving institutions and HBCUs and tribally controlled colleges or universities, members and representatives of special populations, representatives of agencies serving out-of-school youth, homeless children and youth, and at-risk youth, representatives of Indian tribes and tribal organizations, and individuals with disabilities. So if you're in your state and you represent any of these groups, be sure to get involved in helping develop your state plan. The state plan contents somewhat simplified from Perkins 4, where there were 20 items listed in Perkins 4, there are now 14, but 9 of them reference equity-related items. And let me give you a quick overview of these. First is that the state's strategic vision and set of goals for preparing an educated and skilled workforce must include special populations, and also that there's an item focused on expanding access to CTE for special populations, making information on programs of study and career pathways, guidance, and advisement resources available to special populations provided in language students, parents, and educators can understand, ensuring equal access to activities assisted under the Act for special populations, improving outcomes and reducing performance gaps for CTE concentrators, including those that are members of special populations, supporting professional development that provides the knowledge, skills needed to work with and improve instruction for special populations, and a set of assurances describing program strategies for special populations that provide equal access, that they won't be discriminated against, that special populations will meet or exceed state-determined levels of performance, prepare for further learning and for employment, and appropriate accommodations will be provided. Instruction and work-based learning opportunities in integrated settings that support competitive integrated employment are all parts of that. Also, a description of how the eligible agency will address disparities or gaps in performance in each of the plan years, and if no meaningful progress has been achieved prior to the third program year, a description of the additional actions the eligible agency will take to eliminate these disparities or gaps. Also, provide assurances that the eligible agency will use the funds to promote preparation for high-skill, high-wage, or in-demand occupations and non-traditional fields, implement CTE programs and programs of study in state correctional institutions, including juvenile justice facilities, and provide technical assistance on how to close gaps in student participation and performance in CTE programs. The Secretary has the authority to disapprove a state plan within 120 days of receipt if the plan does not meet the requirements of the Act. So when we talked earlier about state-determined levels of performance in terms of holding states accountable to high standards, the only recourse that the Secretary has to ensure that is to actually disapprove a state plan, send it back to a state, and ask them to make those revisions. So I'm going to now move on to the next section, which is improvement plans. So the improvement plans in Perkins 4, you may recall, at the state and local level, basically were triggered after a 90% threshold was not met on a particular performance measure, and that is continues to be the threshold for triggering improvement plans. This section requires states and locals to include an analysis of the performance disparities or gaps and actions that will be taken to address such gaps. So again, that's language that I mentioned earlier about the gap analysis that needs to be conducted. That's also part of the improvement planning process. And it retains sanctions at the state and local level after failure to implement an improvement plan or failure to meet at least 90% of a state-determined level of performance for any core indicator for 2 consecutive years after being identified for improvement. This basically makes the timeline for sanctions the same as in Perkins 4, 3 years failing to meet at least 90% of the state-determined levels of performance. The first year will trigger the improvement planning process, and then if 90% it still continues to not be met for 2 additional years, then that state or local would be could potentially be sanctioned and funds removed, and those funds used either another institution or for with other LEAs. The agency shall not be eligible to adjust performance levels while executing an improvement plan, and this is critically important because if you're not making your measure an option to renegotiate your particular performance measure down is not an option in this law. So again, this emphasizes how important it is that when setting the state-determined levels of performance, that the baseline data that's collected for doing so is accurate, and that definitions are clear, and that your accountability systems have been set up so that the quality and reliability of the data that's being collected will sustain itself over time, so that measurement and there's no shifts in measurement performance because of data quality issues. All right, let's do a quick poll again here. And the new poll is, has your state ever used sanctions? The sanction option under Perkins 4 to reallocate resources from an underperforming LEA. And looks like we're getting some responses in at this moment. And we had if I remember, I think we had about 10% of the group on the webinar on Monday indicated that a yes to this response. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share it with you now. And you'll see that today, about 26% of those who are on today's webinar are in states or from states where sanction options have been applied to LEAs. So that process could continue under Perkins 5. Certainly, it's an option that the state and or the secretary can apply. All right, let's move on to state leadership activities. There are 5 required uses of funds in the state leadership activities section, and state leadership activities can be provided directly by the SEA, the state education agency, or through a grant process to an intermediary. There are 5 required uses of funds. These include providing preparation for non-traditional fields in current and emerging professions and other activities that expose students, including special populations, to high skill, high wage, and in-demand occupations. Serving individuals in state institutions, such as state correctional institutions, including juvenile justice facilities, and educational institutions that serve individuals with disabilities. Recruiting, preparing, and retaining CTE teachers. Faculty, specialized instructional support personnel, paraprofessionals such as pre-service professional development or leadership development programs, providing technical assistance, reporting on the effectiveness of the funds in reducing disparities or performance gaps.
Mimi, the poll is still up. We can't see your
I'm
slides.
so sorry. I keep forgetting to hide the polls. I get so excited about the response. All right.
Thanks.
So 5 required uses of funds, which I just mentioned. There are also a list of permissible uses of funds, many of which relate to equity in Perkins 5. So these include professional development on how to provide appropriate accommodations for students who are members of special populations, including using the principles of universal design for learning, multi-tier systems of support, and positive behavioral interventions and support. Supporting eliminating inequities in student access to high-quality programs of study. Supporting the, and effective educators, awarding incentive grants for exemplary performance by eligible recipients in exceeding the local adjusted levels of performance established under the accountability system, and also incentive grants to eligible recipients' progress in closing achievement gaps among subpopulations who participate in programs of study. Providing CTE services for adults and out-of-school youth concurrent with their completion of secondary school education in a school or other educational setting. Support for programs and activities that increase access, student engagement, and student success in STEM, particularly for underrepresented students, including female students, minority students, and students who are members of special population. And support for CTE student organizations, especially with respect to efforts to increase the participation of students who are members of special populations. This is a significant long list of permissible use of funds and gives states a significant flexibility around the use of these state leadership activities to support a non-traditional career preparation as well as all of the special population groups. Let's move on then to the local application. You'll notice that in Perkins 5, the terminology is local applications, where in Perkins 4, it was called a local plan. This could be interpreted to mean that this should be an application process, that there's not a sort of determined self-evident receipt of funds to LEAs, but that they actually have to apply for them. And this application must contain a description of the results of the comprehensive needs assessment and how special populations will learn about CTE course offerings and whether each course is part of a CTE program of study. So it's critical about how CTE is promoted, and the kinds of outreach activities have to be included in the local application. In addition, this comprehensive needs assessment becomes critically important. Included in the application is a description of how the eligible recipient will address disparities or gaps in performance in each of the plan years, and if no meaningful progress has been achieved prior to the third program year, a description of the additional actions to be taken to eliminate those disparities or gaps. Similar language that you may have heard me talk about in the state plan. The comprehensive needs assessment includes a variety of aspects, certainly looking at your local economy and indicating how programs of study should be designed and developed to meet those needs. There's also a very strong component in the needs assessment around evaluating the performance of students served by the eligible recipient regarding their performance on the measures included in the accountability system. And this needs assessment includes an evaluation of strategies needed to close gaps, to overcome barriers that result in lowering rates of access to or performance gaps in the courses and programs for special populations, providing programs that are designed to enable special populations to meet local levels of performance, and providing activities to prepare special populations for high skill, high wage, or in-demand sectors or occupations in competitive integrated settings that will lead to self-sufficiency. There is a requirement to consult with representatives of special populations and representatives of LEAs serving out-of-school youth, homeless children and youth, and at-risk youth, and representatives of Indian tribes and tribal organizations in conducting this particular needs assessment and also in the LEA's application. The local uses of funds include some new language around career exploration and career development for students, including middle school students. So this really expands the opportunity to be able to do outreach into middle schools and to provide introductory courses or activities focused on career exploration and career awareness, including non-traditional fields to students included in the middle grades. That's actual language that's in the law. Any other activity, the other thing that this career exploration activities may include are any other activity that advances knowledge or career opportunities and assists students in making informed decisions about future education and employment goals, including non-traditional fields. What's important is that there are 6 required uses of funds in the local uses of funds section. 5 of the 6 required uses of funds include activities related to equity. The 6 required uses of funds include underneath each of them a list of what might be considered permissible uses, because the language it says which may include is an important definition here.
Mimi,
So,
you
yes.
have a message in the middle of the slide about rebooting your computer.
I'm sorry, thank you. That should have been shut off this morning, I apologize. The local uses of funds, another required use of funds is to provide professional development for teachers, principals, school leaders, administrators, and career guidance counselors or paraprofessionals, which may include, these are the permissible uses, supporting the implementation of strategies to improve student achievement and close gaps in student participation and performance in CTE, advanced knowledge and skills, understanding and pedagogical practices, providing accommodations for individuals with disabilities, and frameworks to effectively teach students, including a particular focus on students with disabilities and English learners, which may include universal design for learning, multi-tier systems of support, and positive behavioral interventions. Another required uses of funds is to provide within CTE the skills necessary to pursue careers in high skill, high wage, or in-demand industry or sectors or occupations, which I mentioned earlier often include career fields non-traditional for women. Another required use of funds is to plan and carry out elements that support the implementation of programs of study and student achievement of the local adjusted levels of performance established under the accountability system. And this may include initiatives that provide students with transition-related services under IDEA, support programs and activities that increase student access, student engagement, and success in STEM for underrepresented students, provide CTE in schools or other educational settings for adults and out-of-school youth to complete their secondary school education or upgrade technical skills, or support to reduce or eliminate out-of-pocket expenses for special populations participating in CTE, including those participating in dual or concurrent enrollment programs or early college high school programs, and supporting the costs associated with fees, transportation, childcare, or mobility challenges for those special populations. And lastly, the fifth of the six required uses of funds that deal with equity. This one is develop and implement evaluations of the activities carried out with funds under this part, including evaluations necessary to complete the comprehensive needs assessment and the local report, all of which include conducting a gap analysis. There's also, in the local uses of funds, the allowability of pooling funds to implement programs of study, and the administrative costs are capped at 5%. So I'm going to ask one more poll. And this is the last one for today. Do you offer CTE exploratory programs for middle school students that explicitly encourage students to participate in a program non-traditional for their gender? And what I mean by that is, in other words, students either are required to choose a non-traditional program to explore, or they are part of the process is to explore all CTE programs, so that it's not about choosing a program, which most students might choose a traditional program rather than choosing a program that would be non-traditional for their gender. So it looks like we've got maybe a 50-50 response going on here. It's still jumping up and down. About half of you have voted, so some of you may or may not know the answer to this or not want to participate. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll since it's been almost a minute and share it with you so you can see that 54% say yes and 46% say no. This is certainly a strategy in terms of getting students to explore non-traditional career fields, a way for them to engage in CTE programs non-traditional for their gender, in an environment where it's an exploratory process, low risk, and a great experience. So we would encourage you to consider this kind of programming. All right. Lastly, I wanted to mention that in this particular legislation in Perkins V, there is a GAO study on programs of study aligned to high-skill, high-wage occupations. This is a federal study that will be done to evaluate the strategies, components, policies, and practices used by eligible agencies or eligible recipients, that means state or local level, receiving funding under this act to successfully assist all students in pursuing and completing programs of study aligned to high-skill, high-wage occupations, and any specific subgroup of students, all of the groups we've mentioned, so race, gender, economically disadvantaged, students with disability, English learners, migrants, homeless students, foster children, children of an active military parent, all in pursuing and completing programs of study aligned to high-skill, high-wage occupations in fields which such subgroup is underrepresented, and any challenges associated with replication of such strategies, components, policies, and practices. So the study should result, I think, in some very interesting outcomes and certainly some things that will help us in terms of learning more about effective practices, policies, and strategies in this field. GAO stands for the Government Accountability Office. Thank you very much, Kathleen. This study will be conducted under consultation with students and parents, eligible agencies and eligible recipients, teachers, specialized support personnel, paraprofessionals, including those with expertise in preparing students for non-traditional fields, special populations, and representatives of business and industry. So there's significant representation of special populations under the consultation section. So if you're interested in consulting on the GAO study, this would be certainly something to volunteer for. And the study will be submitted to the House Education and Workforce Committee and the Senate Health Committee when it's completed. All right, lastly, this is not a poll, but a question that I wanted to ask you all that you would put in the chat for me if you would, that you share your ideas in the chat box about the resources that NAPE should develop to help you implement Perkins 5. I just saw a question pop up about whether the GAO study was a requirement. Actually, let me get to the study. Is the GAO study a requirement prior to states and locals completing plans? So the GAO study is a separate and independent study that will be conducted by the GAO. It's not related at all to any of the implementation of Perkins 5 in relationship to locals and SEAs in their planning processes or receiving funds or any of that. The GAO study will happen totally separately from that. But it should be an interesting study to see what the results help us learn to know about lots of things in CT, but certainly about special populations, access, and success. Question is there an updated list of non-traditional occupations? Who determines that? Excellent question, and this is one of the items that, as many of you know, under Perkins 4, NAPE actually did this as a technical assistance resource for states. At this point, we are in discussion with the Assistant Secretary's office to determine if they are going to complete this or if they need assistance from us in doing this. So I don't have an absolute answer, but all I know is I will tell you that if the OCTAE does not do this, we certainly will, because we think it's an important and critical resource that needs to be out there for states, and so that there's some consistency across the country in terms of identifying non-traditional occupations. If you're interested in volunteering to serve on a review committee for the non-traditional occupations list, I'd love to hear from you about that. One of the things that we are going to do, if we are the ones who end up doing it this time, is to create a list of practitioners who will review the list prior to its submission to be sure that it meets the right criteria for various state accountability systems and doesn't create any issues. I know that there were some issues with the one that we released under Perkins 4, having to do with the crosswalk between the National Educational NES and the standard occupational classifications and the SIP codes. So we'll want to be sure that that will be included. Is there a compiled list or guide on equity funding sources? I'm not sure exactly what you're asking, whether or not what this is about is a list of other sources to fund equity activities in states. But certainly if that's what you're looking for, I would encourage you to go to the Foundation Center. They have a fabulous online searchable database of foundations who fund everything under the sun, and you can put in various criteria to identify potential foundations who will fund equity types of activities. And also there are other federal agencies who have particular interest in this, the National Science Foundation being one, as well as many others. But we will take this on, we will take this as a recommendation that this might be something that would be a great resource for folks. Let's see. Any other questions? Doesn't look like there are any other questions. Anyone else have any additional questions at this point in time? So let me again, while some of you are thinking if there are any questions you need to ask, want to remind you, if you go right now to the materials section on your control panel for today's webinar, there is a handout that basically has all the information in it that I covered in today's webinar. You can also get this summary handout on our Perkins V resource webpage. So that's available at napequity.org. Just go there and you can access that there.
Mimi, there was a comment early on about page 1, section 3, bullet 4. It mentioned
on the handout.
On the handout.
Page 1, section 3, bullet 4. Yes.
Mentions curriculum modification, and the question was whether or not that should read accommodation rather than modification.
No, the language in the law is curriculum modification.
Okay.
Accommodations are mentioned in lots of places in the legislation as well. So providing accommodations to special population students is also, certainly permissible use of funds, or even a required use of funds in some sections. But this particular definition adds some additional language to what support services means. So modifying curriculum, which could be considered an accommodation, actually.
Looks like there's another question.
Okay.
Does the participatory planning committee requirements stay the same?
So the planning committee at the state or local level, there are some additional participants in the planning committee. When I say planning committee, I mean people that need to be consulted in the development of the state plan or local plan. So if you look at the summary that I included, you'll see there's some new groups that are listed. Certainly representatives of special populations, as well as other HBCUs is named, for example, and tribal organizations are also included. Those kinds of groups are important in including that in or consulting with them in the development of the state plan. And unless the language you're using is asking me a different question, maybe you could ask some clarification in the chat box if there's more information that you need.
There's a question about occupations that are not necessarily high skill, high wage, such as early childhood.
So these are still considered non-traditional because the definition for non-traditional is an occupational field in which the individuals employed in that field are less than 25% of one gender, and that is true in childcare occupations. It's just not an occupational area that would be considered high wage, for example. So there are various aspects of that, but in terms of just the non-traditional definition of itself, early childhood is considered part of the non-traditional definition, if that's what you're asking me. I see that there's a question about which grades are included in the middle school definition, and I don't want to misspeak, and I actually am not absolutely sure about that unless there's someone on the webinar who knows the answer to that question.
Michael
good.
Tinsley.
Michael, 5 to 8. I was going to say that, but I didn't want to misspeak. So thank you, Michael, very much for the technical assistance. So 5th to 8th grade is the middle school definition. All right, at this point, I'm going to then turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Ben Williams, and ask him to go ahead and close out today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Mimi, and thank you everyone for a wonderfully engaging webinar and conversation around Perkins V and the different equity provisions within the new legislation. And thank you also for your feedback on those tools that would be useful as you move forward with the planning process. Those are items that we will be making note of and using as we put together different resources on the webpage that is before you, napequity.org/Perkins V for Perkins V. And those resources will be made available as they are created, and we will be informing the community through various means, including our national listserv. So if you have not yet signed up for our pipeline press, you can do that directly from our homepage. We'll also be communicating those resources through our NAPE membership, so through our NAPE update, as well as periodic email blasts. This year, we are collaborating with Advance, CTE, ACTE, and the American Association of Community Colleges, AACC, in regional planning meetings that will be occurring around the country later this fall. And information on those meetings will be sent out to state directors in career technical education very shortly. These are designed in particular for the state directors who will then be providing assistance at the local level. So we will continue to keep everyone in the loop as we move forward. And if there are additional resources and services that would be useful to you, please let us know. We look forward to our continued partnership with you, and we thank you for participating in today's webinar. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll look forward to talking again soon.